There comes a day when you look at yourself in the mirror, broken inside, and for the first time realize you can't keep going by pretending everything is fine. That was my turning point, and from that very moment, this audiobook was born. Not out of clever advice or empty phrases, but from real experience, exhaustion, clarity, and the courage to stop sugarcoating. 20 chapters that don't aim to lecture you, but perhaps meet you exactly where you stand inside, even if you've told no one. If you're listening to this, you may have already begun to let go of your role. And if so, then here something new begins. Chapter 1. The Smile That Broke Me. There was a time when I smiled automatically, like buckling a seatbelt without thinking. Whenever someone asked how I was, the answer fired out like a bullet. A quick smile, a calm look, a relaxed tone. I'd played that role so often I no longer noticed I was acting. It didn't hurt physically. The forced smile didn't strain my facial muscles. The wear was different, much slower, much quieter. It gathered someplace deep within me, like dust in a drawer you only see when you open it, and everything's gray. That's how it felt. You don't notice until you're utterly covered in dust inside. I learned early to hide my feelings, not because anyone taught me directly, but because strength around me meant showing no weakness. No one said, "We don't cry here," but it was in the air. Every time I suppressed something, I was rewarded. Peace, recognition, calm. So I smiled, and life carried on. In time, that behavior became part of me. When something's been part of you so long, at some point you forget you ever had a choice. The worst was, the smile worked. People thought I was okay, calm, stable, reliable. And of course I nodded. Who wouldn't want that? But inside I had no peace. I was tired even on good days. I slept poorly. My head was full, my mouth silent, because I knew if I began to speak, everything might collapse, and I didn't want to break anything. Neither the image others had of me, nor the last scraps of my emotional balance. So I held on, and kept smiling. Eventually, the smile wasn't a tool. It was a prison. I was trapped in a version of myself that no longer fit. I didn't just pretend all was well. I repressed everything that didn't match the facade. Sadness, exhaustion, the silent rage that grows when you deny it. I covered it all with a pleasant, functional mask. Yes, there were genuine moments of laughter, times I truly had fun or could briefly exhale. But mostly, that smile sprang from the idea of how I should seem. I became an emotional facade, and maintaining it is exhausting. Controlling your reactions, filtering words, planning pauses. Then you don't live. You perform. Acting is draining, no matter how skilled you are. Eventually, you go hollow. And when that happens, you don't know how to escape without everything crashing down. My turning point wasn't dramatic. No sudden explosion or cinematic revelation. It was a quiet evening. Someone close simply asked, "Are you really okay, or are you just saying the usual?" I fell silent. I had no honest answer, because I'd told myself for so long that all was well. I'd lost touch with how I truly felt. I didn't cry that night. I didn't shout. I just sat in stillness. And in that stillness, I realized the problem wasn't my pain or what happened to me, but how utterly I'd abandoned myself. I'd built an inner house that looked neat from the outside, but whose basement lay in ruins. And there, buried in chaos, was everything I'd never dared to feel. You only see how much you're cheating yourself when you pause functioning and look honestly. And yes, it hurts. Shameful to admit how long you pretended. You feel weak, maybe ridiculous, but it's necessary. That's where the beginning lies. Letting go of the smile wasn't easy. It still surfaces reflexively. But I started pausing when asked how I was, not to concoct a better lie, but to feel what was inside. Sometimes I'd say I didn't know. Sometimes I'd admit exhaustion or overwhelm. And I discovered the world didn't fall apart when I was honest. People didn't run away or judge me. Instead, spaces opened where I could be real, and those spaces saved me. Today, I don't want merely to seem okay. I want to be okay. If that means showing vulnerability, tired, overwhelmed, honest, then I do it. Pretending required more strength than being genuine. That smile once protected me, but it also crushed me. When I shed it, I didn't grow weaker. I became freer. It wasn't a leap or a drum roll, just a slow rediscovery. And it was enough. Chapter 2. The applause that hurt me. It took me ages to see that recognition isn't love, and applause isn't connection. I thought if I did everything right, met expectations, delivered results, I'd be seen, valued, maybe loved. And yes, I got applause. Pats on the back, compliments, admiring glances. It felt good. At first. I was praised for my composure, my reliability, my drama-free steadiness. Admired for discipline, focus, endurance. I learned fast how to earn approval, when to nod, listen, speak. I mastered the game and played it well. But no one saw, least of all I initially, how much of myself I sacrificed. I molded myself to please. I sensed what others wanted to hear and delivered it. Each thank you deepened my illusion of being on the right path, though really I was drifting from myself. It began subtly, silencing annoyance to spare the mood, smiling while seething, saying yes instead of no, bottling anger to keep the peace. The praise kept coming, so I felt compelled to continue. I grew addicted to validation, not out of vanity, but to feel needed, noticed, valuable. We can always count on you made me feel alive. That sense of significance was dangerous. I began to tie my worth to how much I gave, to how indispensable I was. If the applause stopped, I felt empty, useless, replaceable. Applause became a drug and a trap. Once you've tasted admiration, you fear losing it. I started burning out, ignoring boundaries just to stay in that role. I feared disappointing anyone, feared appearing changed. So I persevered and lost myself. I forgot what mattered to me, buried my needs under others. I became a service provider for my own life. Everything perfect, no complaints, always functioning. Outwardly present, inwardly absent. Worst of all, I'd lost the courage to say no without guilt. Then my body protested. Insomnia, exhaustion, irritability, chronic tension. I convinced myself it was normal, part of giving so much. Only when I unexpectedly burst into tears in an everyday moment did I realize something had overflowed. I'd silenced so many needs that they finally demanded to be heard. In that moment, no applause followed, only silence. And that silence was exactly what I needed. No judgment, no expectations, just calm. I began to see that external praise couldn't fill my inner void. I had never listened to myself because I was too busy pleasing. I'd neglected my own needs in favor of others. And the truth is, if you try to be everything to everyone, you end up nothing to yourself. Stepping out wasn't easy. I'd tied my identity to being needed. I had to learn I wasn't here to keep everyone else happy, that it wasn't my duty to fulfill expectations I never chose. I had to disappoint others, and that hurt. But it was necessary. Because those who never disappoint never live authentically. Those who only give what's expected lose touch with their own needs. I began to do less, to please less, to stop letting others' reactions guide me. Yes, I lost something. My picture-perfect reliability cracked. But through those cracks came air, and I could finally breathe. Today I know applause is lovely when genuine. But if it pulls you away from yourself, it's a dangerous gift. I still appreciate sincere praise, but I no longer chase it. Instead, I ask, what do I truly want? What feels right even if no one notices or applauds? Breaking this pattern isn't easy, especially after years of success, but the price of constant approval is too high, and I stopped paying it. I no longer want to be admired for what I'm not. I no longer want to function just to please. I choose honesty, however uncomfortable, and if the applause fades, so be it. I'd rather walk my path in silence than lose myself in applause for a life that was never mine. Chapter 3. What no one sees when you look good. There's that moment when someone looks you in the eye and says, "You seem so balanced. I wish I had your inner calm." You nod, maybe smile gratefully, knowing it's a compliment. What they don't see, or perhaps don't want to see, is what it costs you to look that way. Most people judge by surface patterns, not malice. If you're well-groomed, friendly, punctual, eloquent, you pass as stable. If you seem to juggle work, friends, fun, and burden no one, you're okay. But that image often tells nothing of your inner life when you're alone at night. I was someone who looked good, not aesthetically, but behaviorally. Calm, polite, helpful, present, never loud. I mastered conversation etiquette, conflict avoidance, room reading, standing out without disrupting. And so no one asked how I really was, because everything looked fine. Functioning, I've learned, is a survival mechanism for those who can't afford to break. I arranged my feelings like furniture, unobtrusively, systematically, so they never got in the way. I felt deeply but inside. I didn't know how to let it out without overloading myself or others. Years of believing clarity and control beat openness and chaos taught me self-censorship. Not from cowardice, but survival. I analyzed, filtered, calculated, wary of being an inconvenient emotional burden. So each day I chose the face that raised fewer questions, the gaze that reassured rather than unsettled. I remember being utterly exhausted inside, yet keeping appointments, finishing tasks, remembering birthdays, laughing in meetings, even giving advice. No one would guess my heart burned. At times I felt I might implode mid-smile because the gap between my outer composure and inner turmoil had become unbearable. It's odd to be admired for strength when you can barely feel yourself. To be called resilient because you never complain, even though you're burning up inside. To hear your poise praised while you lie in bed at night, silent, not from peace, but from exhaustion. That facade isn't a classical lie. It's years of conditioning that taught you showing pain robs you of space. Once, over coffee with a close friend, I was in good spirits, joking, asking questions, on top of things. They said casually, "I admire you. Everything seems so easy for you." I flinched inside, not offended, but because I felt how far my image had drifted from my reality, and I had only myself to blame. No one meant harm. But if you only ever show your strong, friendly, balanced side, people believe that's all you are. They forget you can be helpless, have doubts, dark days. And when you finally reveal something that doesn't fit, they look confused or startled, discouraging you from trying again. This isolation is quiet, not loneliness in the classic sense. You're surrounded by people, you talk, you laugh, but inwardly you withdraw, convinced no one can see your burden. Over time, you lose the words to express what you feel, not because you don't feel, but because you lack safe language to speak it without sounding alien to yourself. I had to relearn to honor my own perceptions, not by wallowing dramatically, but by stopping the concealment. I began small, honest moments, today's a hard day, or I'm tired, not physically, but differently. Slowly, I learned authenticity isn't a burden when it has space. Today, I see many looking good people around me and recognize them instantly. The controlled expression, the perfect answer, the flicker in the eyes that darts away too fast. I don't always speak up, but sometimes I ask again, how are you really? And sometimes, just sometimes, a crack appears. Then I know. Starting first was worth it. Because what no one sees when you look good is often what matters most. Not your facade, not your functional self, but what you carry when alone, what you endure unseen, who you are when you stop pretending life is easy. Chapter 4. The day I had enough of everything happens for a reason. I can't recall when I first heard that phrase. Everything happens for a reason. I was probably a child. Back then it sounded comforting, as if a silent intelligence would one day piece together life's puzzle, even when it made no sense. It was offered at breakups, losses, failed projects, sudden setbacks, a mantra when nothing else came. For a time I believed it. Perhaps I wanted to believe that chaos had a purpose. I didn't hate the phrase at first, but eventually I felt it ceased to help. It became an empty shell draped over real feelings to move on faster. Rather than creating space for pain, it quick-fixed meaning. What I didn't understand then, but see clearly now, is that not every wound needs immediate explanation. Some wounds need time, listening, breathing room. My clarity arrived in a painful moment, emotionally spent, sleepless, filled with unanswerable questions. Sitting with someone who meant well, who wanted to help me stand again, they said, maybe all this had to happen. Maybe there's a higher purpose. I nodded politely, thanked them, even forced a small smile. Inside, though, I teetered on the edge of rage. Not at them, but at what that phrase did to me. In that moment, I didn't want meaning. I didn't want my pain compressed into a cosmic narrative that smoothed it over. I wanted to feel sad without someone tacking a life lesson onto it. I didn't want pain labeled necessary. I wanted to feel it, uncommented, unforced. The constant hunt for meaning can comfort, yes, but it brutalizes when obligatory. When you feel you must extract growth from every wound before you've even acknowledged its hurt. As if every pain must dress up as a message before you may grieve. I rushed meaning, forced myself to let go of things I hadn't understood, tried to seem strong while crumbling inside, convinced I had to rise above pain and turn it immediately useful. Until I finally had enough. Enough of the notion that suffering is necessary. Enough of embracing every experience before I understood it. Enough of spiritualizing pain as if it were a gift wrongly wrapped. I learned that not everything needs explanation to exist. It's valid to feel helpless without finding meaning. Some things just hurt, period. And that period is as valid as any exclamation full of insight. What I craved wasn't comfort, but honest endurance. Someone who stays when there's nothing to fix, who doesn't hunt blame or purpose, but sits beside you as you fall apart, without promising future gratitude. I've seen how we rush to outshine darkness instead of passing through it. How impatient we are when someone doesn't recover quickly. How hard it is to say, this is terrible, and I don't know why. Perhaps the danger of everything happens for a reason lies more in its expectation that you must learn, grow, transform instantly, than in its content. I stopped complying. I don't need deeper meaning to justify my tears or a greater plan to say, this hurts. I won't pretend every fracture is an invitation to growth. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I decide, not a platitude. To this day I have losses without reasons, questions unanswered, wounds that never found words. And I learned I can go on. My growth doesn't hinge on turning every pain into poetry. Today I say, not everything happens for a reason. Some things just happen, and they change us. Sometimes not in the ways we need or want. Sometimes they leave emptiness we must accept, not fill. Real strength may lie not in understanding, but in allowing, not in reinterpreting, but in enduring, not in finding a reason, but in relinquishing the idea that there must be one. Chapter 5. The Fear of Destroying the Wrong Thing. It's strange how long we cling to what no longer serves us. Relationships, routines, habits, jobs, beliefs that drain our energy, leave us tired, empty, small inside. Yet we cling, not because we think they're good, but because the thought of letting go scares us more than enduring them. I took ages to realize you can get used to pain, that unhealthy things can feel familiar, and that familiarity paralyzes. We stay though we want to leave, say yes though we scream no, keep going though there's no future, out of fear for what comes next. I remember waking each morning with a lump in my throat, not missing anything tangible but clarity. I knew I lived a life that no longer fit. Still, I told myself it was just a phase, that one endures, that nothing must be perfect, that others manage fine. So I held on, to shallow conversations, to burnout obligations, to versions of myself that no longer rang true. I functioned within structures promising security, but really setting boundaries. Each day I stayed, the self-betrayal grew, but I feared. What if I let go and regret it? What if I destroy something that could still be fixed? That fear wasn't irrational. It was rooted deep. Destroying something means taking responsibility, relinquishing hope it'll heal itself. I feared being the one to crack the foundation, though it was already crumbling. I thought endurance was strength, patience a virtue, but it was convenience in disguise. Eventually, I asked, what am I trying to save? A memory, a facade of stability, or just my fear of the unknown? I realized the real pain lay not in change, but in living against my truth too long. The truth was clear. This no longer worked, no longer fit, and clinging only numbs me. There's a difference between broken and over. Many things in my life weren't visibly broken. They were functional, stable, maybe even enviable. But they were over. For my growth, my evolution. Accepting that was harder than I admitted, because it meant letting go before a collapse forced me. We're taught to endure, fight, persevere, but rarely to recognize when enough is enough, when a door can be closed by choice, not by force. I recall the first steps I took. Small decisions, honest conversations, overdue actions. Fear surfaced each time. What if I err? But each step returned a piece of me. Clarity, self-respect, silence not as emptiness but as space to breathe. Sometimes destruction is necessary, not because something is evil or worthless, but because it bars your true self. That requires courage, not loud revolt or risk-taking, but quiet, uncomfortable honesty, saying, "This doesn't work," and refusing to pretend otherwise. Today, I know my greatest mistake wasn't questioning too much, but staying silent too long, hoping something would change itself, waiting for pain to force a solution instead of taking responsibility. I learned you can end things without vilifying them, let go without justifying, and leave without guilt, even if it breaks something others loved. If it eats you alive, it's already broken. You're just the one brave enough to say so. Yes, an emptiness remains, a hole, a vacuum, unrest. Change is rarely graceful, but in that unrest lies the chance to rediscover yourself, without old patterns, false roles, or the pressure to uphold what once shrank you. I had to lose myself to see I wasn't lost in destruction, but in the fear of it. And now I no longer dread breaking. I dread continuing in what paralyzes me inside. Sometimes the bravest act isn't building but ending what no longer feels right. And that needs no applause, only honesty and the readiness to take yourself seriously again. Chapter 6. When I stopped trying to save everyone. It was never my conscious intention to be the rescuer. I never set out or planned to be that person. It just crept in. At first it was care, genuine compassion, the desire to help, to be there, to relieve burdens. It began with small things, listening, showing up, looking for solutions. And then, before I knew it, it had become a silent obligation. I was no longer just someone who liked to help. I felt responsible for the emotional equilibrium of everyone around me. I couldn't sit still when someone was sad. I barely tolerated conflict hanging in the air. I felt a nearly physical restlessness whenever someone was disappointed, hurt, or angry. And my first impulse was always the same. Do something. Fix the situation. Soothe the pain. Have the necessary conversation. Break the silence. Mediate. Explain. Calm. I was like an emotional firefighter, always on alert. And the tragic part was that nobody had asked this of me. I'd imposed it on myself. There were nights when I lay awake turning others' problems over in my mind. Not because I had to, but because I couldn't stop. I hunted for the right words, for ways, for possibilities to ease their burden. And as I wore myself down, I simultaneously felt important. Because whoever helps feels significant. Whoever rescues is needed. That was my inner bargain. I sacrifice a piece of myself, and in return, I no longer feel useless. But the longer I lived like that, the more exhausted I became. Not because helping itself was wrong, but because I no longer gave it from a place of strength, but from fear. I was terrified of what would happen if I let go, if I was no longer the one holding everything together. I believed that things would fall apart around me the moment I stopped pulling the strings. And I held on so tightly that eventually I could barely breathe. I remember a day when I was utterly spent physically. I'd slept almost nothing. My head throbbed. My body felt heavy. My heart was tired. Yet there I was on the phone, listening to someone run the same circles, complain the same complaints, spin around the same story. I was present. I said the right things. I reassured. And when the call ended, I sat for minutes, utterly empty, as if wrung out. And in that moment I realized for the first time, I'm saving no one. I'm simply keeping the drama alive because I don't dare step away. That wasn't a pleasant thought. It hurt to acknowledge, because it meant my helping wasn't always helpful, that my constant availability sometimes prevented the change that was needed. And it meant I had to ask myself, why am I doing this at all? I began to see that I'd never allowed myself to be weak. I was the rock, the anchor, the one who always knew what to do. And that status was more than a role. It was my self-worth. If I was no longer the person people turned to in trouble, who was I? The answer didn't come all at once, but it came in the form of fatigue, in the form of setting boundaries, in the growing need not to catch everyone's falls, and finally in a sentence I spoke aloud for the first time. I can't do this anymore. Not as an attack, not in anger, but as an honest acknowledgement of my own limit. What happened next surprised me. The world did not collapse. Those I thought depended on me didn't crumble. Some were puzzled, a few disappointed, a handful withdrew. But most responded with something I never expected: understanding, perhaps even relief. Because the moment I stopped rescuing them, they gave themselves permission to take responsibility. I had to learn that I serve no one by losing myself, that it isn't my job to prevent every pain. Some pain is necessary for growth, and that my worth isn't measured by how much I sacrifice for others, but by how honestly I treat myself. There is a difference between compassion and self-abandonment, and I didn't see it for a long time. Today I strive to be present without dissolving into others' struggles. I listen without feeling responsible. I support without carrying burdens that aren't mine. And sometimes that means saying no, not out of selfishness, but out of clarity. Because I've learned, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can't pull someone out of something they themselves haven't let go of. And the more you try, the more you lose yourself in a fight that was never yours. Setting boundaries isn't heartless. It's an act of self-respect. I am no longer the hero in every story, and that's a relief. I'm not on call around the clock. I don't carry everyone's problems just because I can, and the more space I give myself, the clearer it becomes. I'm no less valuable because I no longer save everyone. On the contrary, I'm more real. I'm back to myself. Chapter 7. The problem that remains when you keep silent. I kept silent for a long time. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned it's often easier to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. I clamped my mouth shut when something pressed in me, when something hurt, when I felt overwhelmed. I said everything was fine, even when it wasn't. I played the peacemaker, the calm one, the understanding one. I called it tact. I called it maturity. In truth, it was fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of burdening someone. Fear of losing control and uttering something irretrievable. So I swallowed it again and again. I bottled up anger, wrapped sadness in irony, made pain invisible. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I held back when I should have spoken, and no one noticed. At first, that silence felt like control. I believed it preserved my dignity. I thought you needn't share everything, that some things were better left inside. I was proud of myself for keeping it together, for not overreacting, for staying rational. And for a while it worked. I appeared stable, collected, poised. But what I overlooked was the cost of that silence. The more I kept quiet, the more I distanced myself from myself. Not overnight, it was gradual. I began to censor my own feelings. I questioned each need for its legitimacy. I wondered whether my pain was real or if I was just too sensitive. And I learned not only to lie to others, but to disbelieve myself. Eventually, I noticed I talked a lot in conversations without ever revealing anything essential. I could spend whole days among people without anyone guessing how I truly felt. That feeling of being seen, not superficially, but truly, became so rare I almost forgot what it was like. The problem with silence isn't just that no one hears you. The problem is that eventually no one asks. Not out of indifference, but because you so convincingly project having it all under control. You're called strong, thoughtful, balanced, and maybe you are, in a way. But strength without access to your wounds isn't a foundation. It's armor, and the longer you wear it, the heavier it becomes. I learned that unspoken pain doesn't vanish. It buries deeper, and sooner or later it resurfaces in unexpected ways, as tension in the body, as exhaustion, as irritability, or in outbursts triggered by the smallest things. Not because they were so terrible, but because you've suppressed so much else. I remember a conversation I avoided for years, about something that hurt me deeply and persistently. I'd decided at the time to say nothing, afraid to endanger our relationship or lose what remained. I lied to myself that I'd moved on, that it no longer mattered. But whenever I met that person, I felt an invisible knot in me, an unsaid word hanging between us even as we laughed and embraced. And I realized I hadn't resolved anything. I'd merely clamped the lid shut. Silence didn't diffuse the tension. It froze it. And anything frozen thaws eventually, but not always at a convenient moment. I learned back then that honesty doesn't always bring immediate peace, but it brings clarity. And without clarity, no genuine trust can form. I had to admit my silence wasn't noble, mature, or considerate. It was self-denial, and one of the most dangerous forms, because it's quiet. It drums no drama. It simply corrodes you from within. I began to change how I spoke to myself. I allowed myself to name uncomfortable truths. I stopped relativizing everything. I said, "That hurt me," or "I'm disappointed." Not as accusations, but as statements of fact. And every time I did, something grew lighter. Not always happier, but truer. Speaking painful truths takes courage. Not because the words themselves are dangerous, but because they lay you bare, open to attack. And you never know what follows. But what I know now is, what isn't said keeps speaking through your behavior, your silence, your fatigue, your distance. And it doesn't quiet down the longer you ignore it. It only gets more garbled until you no longer know why you feel the way you do. Only that it's heavy, cramped, empty. Today I don't speak about everything. I filter. I weigh. But I no longer default to silence. I speak when something burdens me, not to create drama, but to make space for authenticity, for connection, for healing. Because what you hide never stops talking. It talks through how you act, through what you don't say, through how tired or distant you become. And it won't get quieter until you give it a voice. Chapter 8. The Goals That Were Never Mine. I spent a large part of my life chasing things I never chose myself, not because someone forced me, not because someone told me, "This is your path." It was subtler, quieter, almost imperceptible. It began with expectations, with images, with ideas of what a good life looked like: secure, successful, respected. I absorbed those images without questioning them. I pursued them with ambition, as if they were born from my own heart. And then I realized I had accomplished much, but none of it truly belonged to me. I remember standing in my apartment, everything around me functional, orderly, structured, the way you arrive when you've made it. Yet I felt empty, not dramatic, not sad, but a quiet sense of itching unfamiliarity in my own skin. I could no longer explain to myself why I did what I did. I went through the motions without purpose. I was tired even when I'd slept. And I knew this life was the sum of decisions I'd once made, not from my own desires, but from a silent wish to be right. Right in the sense of fitting in, of being sensible, of doing what you're supposed to do. I pursued career milestones for the recognition they brought. I fit into systems that promised security. I built things to impress from the outside, and each time someone said, "You've come so far," I'd nod, smile, feel a brief sting of validation, only for it to dissolve seconds later into emptiness, because none of it filled what was lacking inside me, a genuine sense of meaning. I defined success by standards that were never mine. I followed models that didn't match my inner map. And because I long believed that adapting was normal, that you adjust to find your place, I never asked whether that place was really mine. I was proud when I hit targets, validated when I met expectations. But deep down I knew, this isn't authentic. This isn't me. It's a well-oiled version of me, but not a living one. Admitting that wasn't easy. It meant acknowledging I'd spent time, energy, strength on something that didn't nourish me. And no one likes admitting they've run in the wrong direction while everyone applauds. No one wants to say, "I don't want this anymore," when from the outside it looks like success. But that realization shifted something in me. I stopped asking, What should I achieve? And began asking, what am I missing? Existentially, not materially. I missed feeling in harmony with myself. I missed passion, curiosity, lightness. I missed doing things that didn't exhaust me but made me feel alive. And I discovered I hadn't felt those things for a long time. Not because life was too hard, but because I'd lost myself in a plan I never wrote. The turning point didn't come with drama or collapse. It was a series of small awakenings. Conversations where I had nothing to add. Routines that no longer fulfilled. Goals that no longer moved me. I looked at my life and saw a solid foundation, but a cold building atop it. Technically perfect, emotionally empty. So I started asking questions. What would I do if I didn't need to prove anything? If I weren't afraid to disappoint? If it really were just about me? What would I let go? What would I pursue? What would I start anew? And the more I asked, the clearer it became. I had to let go. Not everything, but what was never mine. Goals I'd adopted like ill-fitting clothes. I began to challenge things I once took for granted. I released projects that no longer fulfilled me. I declined offers that sounded tempting but left me hollow. I distanced myself from the constant drive to be showcase ready. And what remained was at first uncertainty, because after chasing others' goals, I didn't yet know my own. But I chose to sit with that emptiness, because at least it was honest. Then, over time, something returned, not loudly or spectacularly, but subtly and tangibly. Interest, joy, creativity, the desire to do things not for praise, but because they moved me. I uncovered parts of myself buried under functionality. I started following my own compass, however fuzzy it still was. And for the first time in years, the goal felt like an invitation, not an obligation. I know now it isn't about giving everything up. It's about discernment, between what drives you and what merely keeps you busy, between what makes your soul grow and what only feeds your ego. That honesty is uncomfortable because it demands radical clarity. But it's necessary if you want to stop living someone else's life. I pursue fewer goals today, but they're mine, and that makes all the difference. I've stopped trying to impress. I no longer justify my choices. I seek to understand myself. It takes more time, patience, courage, but it's worth it. Because nothing weighs heavier than a life lived for another, and nothing feels lighter than the moment you recognize it. Chapter 9. When I realized that being broken wasn't the problem. For a long time I thought my brokenness was the real problem. That the pain, the fatigue, the uncertainty, the things that didn't work, that were hard, that didn't flow, must somehow be fixed, covered up, reworked. I believed healing meant making the cracks disappear, that the goal was a state of wholeness, where I functioned again and appeared as if nothing had happened. So that's exactly what I did. I kept repairing myself. Again and again I patched, suppressed, glossed over, reorganized. I told myself that anything unstable was a weakness, that indiscernible feelings could become dangerous, that I needed to return as quickly as possible to a state others found reassuring. Calm, structured, controlled. But deep down I knew what I was doing wasn't healing. It was adaptation. It was an attempt to handle my inner chaos so no one would notice, so I wouldn't have to look too closely. I treated my fractures like temporary setbacks, as phases to be endured. I wanted to get past them quickly, seeing them only as disruptions, not as part of my journey. The turning point didn't come with a bang. It was a quiet moment when I stopped fighting what was broken inside me. Late one night, exhausted, empty, almost numb, I sat on my apartment floor and allowed myself to feel that something was really off. I stopped telling myself it would soon be better, that I just needed to hang on a little longer. that everything would work out. I looked at myself, without excuses, without hope, without a plan. Only what remained when all layers peeled away: rawness. And strangely, there was no panic, no drama, just a calm I'd never felt before, because I'd finally stopped fighting myself. I was broken, yes, but I was here, and in that state, utterly honest and exposed, something began that I hadn't believed possible. I felt myself again, not as a project, not as a work in progress, but as a person. Not whole, but genuine. I began to understand that my brokenness wasn't an obstacle but an entry point. That it wasn't about becoming whole again as fast as possible, but about discovering what whole really meant. Perhaps I'd never been healed in the way I convinced myself. Perhaps my so-called stability was merely a well-maintained defense, solid but soulless. Maybe breaking wasn't a catastrophe, but a revelation. I recall one day standing with someone who truly liked me, not despite my cracks, but because of them. And for the first time I could accept that without justifying or promising a quick fix. I didn't have to say I was working on myself, that soon I'd function normally again. I could simply be, with all my unresolved edges. And in that encounter I realized how much energy I'd wasted upholding an image I didn't need. I'd strived for perfection no one asked for, insisted on strength I long since lacked. I learned that my fear of being seen as broken held me back more than the state itself. I wasn't afraid of my pain, I was afraid of someone seeing it, that they'd stop taking me seriously if I wasn't stable. But the opposite happened. The moment I showed my true self, real connections formed. Not through strength, but through openness. Not through control, but through vulnerability. My brokenness began to claim its space, not as a flaw, but as part of me. I stopped asking how to fix myself and started asking how I wanted to live, with the damage I carried. I had to stop repairing to begin understanding myself. Healing, I realized, isn't the opposite of pain. It's the space where pain is allowed without letting it dominate. It's not a state of polished perfection, but a process of learning to bear yourself, even when you don't function, even when you're contradictory, fragile, unclear, even when you have no answers. I've accepted I'm not always strong, that I sometimes feel fear, that I've done things I'm not proud of, that I set boundaries too late, give too much, mistrust even when I crave closeness. All of it is part of me. I no longer aim to therapy it away, erase it, or cover it up. I want to learn to carry it, with dignity, awareness, and momentum. Because the problem was never that I was broken. The problem was believing I had to hide it. Chapter 10. Even comfort can wear you down. There's a peculiar feeling that settles in when, on paper, everything's fine. When your daily life works, when you know what to do, when your environment feels stable and no one demands more than you can give. You wake up, follow your routines, tick off your tasks, close the day feeling ordered, and still there's a heaviness. No chaos, no crisis, just an inner yawning that quietly presses on you like a break you can't name. It took me a while to recognize this feeling. I thought perhaps it was just a phase, that I needed more sleep, more breaks, more balance. I tried rest, structure, lists, routines. But the more I tried to organize it away, the clearer it became. This wasn't classical exhaustion. It was comfort. A form of internal rigidity disguised as security, but in truth the opposite. Because even the familiar can exhaust you. Even what you know and control, what brings no fear, can drain your vitality until you lose touch with your aliveness. I was living in a state that wasn't dangerous, but wasn't alive either. Everything was predictable. Everything had its order. And one day I realized I don't actually want to know how life continues when it stays this way. It wasn't dramatic dissatisfaction, no loud protest, just a slow fading of inner tension, curiosity, the sense that there's still something out there for you to discover. I'd settled in comfortably, securely, but also confined. I often said, "It's fine as it is," or "I don't need much." Maybe I believed it. But I also knew deep down I'd grown accustomed to a life that no longer hurt me, but no longer moved me. I remember an evening alone at home with nothing pressing, nothing wrong, yet feeling weighted. Not sad or stressed, simply empty. I observed my surroundings, my choices, my relationships, and found no obvious issues but also nothing that stirred me. It was as if I'd chosen a sensible life out of prudence, and now it was steadily lulling me to sleep. What I lacked wasn't excitement or drama, but vitality, the sense I hadn't arrived, that there was still more to search for, question, risk. Out of fear of unrest, I'd built a structure that shielded me from everything, but didn't move me. And once I understood that, I saw comfort isn't always kind. It often marks the start of an inward retreat. I began to change small things, not in rebellion but driven by a growing need to reconnect with myself. I allowed conversations I'd usually avoid. I declined invitations made out of routine. I questioned whether certain commitments still served me or simply existed because they always had. And the more I dared to step out of that comfort zone, the more energy returned. It's a misconception that only the new can exhaust us. The ever-same can erode us too, especially when it no longer grows with our inner development. I'd adapted to a life that created no friction. And without resistance, I forgot what real movement feels like. Not the outward kind, but the inward. The kind that makes you curious again. That reminds you you're alive. I've learned that security truly nourishes only if it doesn't become an excuse for stasis. That rest heals only if it isn't a flight from growth. And that comfort shouldn't become the goal but a waypoint. A place to catch your breath, not to settle indefinitely. Admitting I was tired while everything worked felt almost ungrateful. Yet I believe much of our greatest drain comes not from apparent problems, but from lives we silently accept, even when they no longer fit. Now I regularly ask myself, does what I'm doing truly awaken me? Or does it merely satisfy my need for control? Am I staying because it fulfills me, or because I don't dare face the unknown? And I allow myself not to have all the answers, just to keep asking. Even that changes things. I know comfort has its place. It protects when we're burnt out, gives structure when everything shakes. But it must never replace meaning, must not become the destination of a life meant for more than safeguarding what's already crumbling. I refuse to settle into states that slowly dull me. I refuse to explain away why things are going well while I drift inward. I choose movement, even if I don't yet know the destination. Because I've learned, sometimes it isn't the new that scares us, but the familiar that no longer sustains. Chapter 11. The truth about self-help that did me more harm than good. I had reached a point in my life where I really wanted to change something. Nothing superficial, no short-term goal, no cosmetic tweak, but something real, something deeper. I felt empty, directionless, not broken in the classic sense, but not quite whole either. I was searching for support, structure, answers, or at least a direction. And like many others in such a moment, I landed in the world of self-help. At first I was thrilled. The books were motivating, the language clear, the promises grand. Everything sounded so logical, so simple. Think positively, change your thoughts, take responsibility, be grateful. Visualize your ideal life. I highlighted passages, took notes, listened to podcasts, devoured title after title. I was convinced, if I took it all seriously, if I stuck with it, my life would transform. And it did change. just not in the way I'd imagined. What I didn't realize at the time was that most of these concepts only worked on paper. Or rather, they worked as long as I worked. As long as I stayed disciplined, slept well, meditated regularly, exercised enough, monitored my thoughts, and looked for the positive in everything, I could convince myself it was working. But the moment something inside me cracked, when I got angry, overwhelmed, began to doubt, or simply couldn't access that artificially generated positivity, everything collapsed, and I along with it. The promises of that self-help world were just too beautiful. You are the creator of your reality. Everything begins in your mind. Suffering arises only through judgment. Those who change attract different experiences. And I believed it. I believed it so much that I began to feel guilty whenever I felt bad. Because if everything is my responsibility, then I must be at fault when I suffer. I must have thought wrong, acted wrong, not journaled enough, not visualized intensely enough. I was under constant inner pressure to optimize my life instead of simply living it. The harder I tried, the further I drifted from myself. I was no longer honest. I was correct. I didn't think in real feelings, but in affirmations. I wasn't sad. I was challenged. I wasn't angry. I questioned my triggers. I no longer spoke real words, but formulas. And at some point, I didn't know if I could even feel myself anymore, or if I was just running a program that had promised me everything would get better if I applied it diligently. I remember exactly when the point came that I stopped trying to identify with that world. It was on one of those days when nothing worked. I had tried everything: meditation, breathing exercises, lists, a gratitude journal, and still I felt empty, irritable, frustrated. Then I heard a line on a podcast that went roughly, "If you feel bad, it's only because you're still thinking in old energy." And something inside me shattered. I was no longer angry at myself. I was angry at the system, at that insidious logic that turns every human emotion into a deficit. I realized that many of these concepts, however well-intentioned, foster a toxic form of control. You're allowed to feel, only as long as it feels good. You're allowed to doubt, but please only briefly. You're allowed to fail, but only if you immediately spin it into a lesson. And you're allowed to be sad, but not for too long, or you'll manifest even more of it. I began to question it all, not out of spite, not out of disappointment, but out of exhaustion. I wanted to learn again how to feel myself without the sense that I constantly had to work on myself. I wanted to learn that it's okay not to function, that it's legitimate simply to want nothing, to improve nothing, to analyze nothing. I wanted to return to a form of being human that isn't measured by productivity and optimization every second. The truth is, self-help can help, but it can also break you if you're not careful. It can make you think you're growing when you're only adapting. It can make you believe you're taking responsibility when you're internally judging yourself. And it can keep you from being honest with yourself, because you're always on the hunt for the next method instead of just sitting with yourself as you are. I had to let all of that go to understand that growth doesn't always mean doing more. Sometimes it means wanting less, needing less control, being less on the hunt for improvement, and trusting more that you're valuable even when you're not creating a new version of yourself. Today, I no longer read self-help books to get better. When I read, it's to remember. To remember that I'm already whole, even if I sometimes feel lost. To remember that pain doesn't mean I did something wrong. And to remember that meaning often isn't found in achieving something, but in standing still and feeling what is. I no longer believe in promises that distance me from my humanity. I believe in the courage to accept it. Chapter 12. The moment I stopped waiting for someone to understand me. I spent a lot of time hoping that someone would truly see me. Not superficially, not through the filter of expectations, not by what I show, but by who I am when I no longer want to explain anything. I longed for someone to intuitively recognize what I felt, what moved me, what I didn't dare speak aloud. And each time it didn't happen, which was most of the time, I withdrew a little further. I think it begins early. That silent hope that someone will read you like a book, breathe between your lines, notice when you laugh, but hold yourself back inside. Someone who doesn't ask if you're okay because they already see you're not. Someone who doesn't immediately offer solutions but simply stays, even when it's uncomfortable. I waited for that person. I looked for them in friendships, in relationships, in encounters, sometimes even in strangers. And the more I waited, the lonelier I became. Over time, that longing turned into disappointment. I began to see lack in every silence, proof in every missed glance that I wasn't important enough. I interpreted not being seen as rejection, and instead of saying what I really felt, I kept quiet, out of defiance, out of pain, out of pride. I didn't want to ask. I wanted someone to figure out what I needed on their own, because if I had to say it myself, it already didn't feel genuine. I didn't realize that this waiting was a form of self-avoidance, that I was leaving my needs to others because I didn't allow them for myself. I made it their job to understand me, while I wasn't willing to show myself as vulnerable. I was disappointed that nobody truly saw me, but I hardly let anyone see me. I showed only parts, the safe parts, the controlled parts, the easily digestible parts. Yet I still expected someone to look through that facade straight into my core. The turning point didn't come with an argument, nor with a great loss. It came on a completely ordinary evening when I was walking home alone. I thought back to a conversation in which I'd once again felt misunderstood. I felt that familiar mix of frustration and resignation, and then, almost casually, the thought came, maybe it's not their job to understand me. Maybe it's mine. And I stopped in my tracks, because I knew something inside me was shifting. All along, I'd been waiting for someone to meet me where I'd never met myself. I wanted from the outside what I'd never truly given myself: attention, empathy, patience. I expected others to hold me up even though I'd never learned to hold myself. And in that moment, it became clear. It wasn't the not being understood that hurt. It was my refusal to take myself seriously when nobody else did. I began to speak to myself differently. I stopped forcing my feelings immediately into words that would please others. I let them be with me first. Raw, unformulated, real. I asked myself whether I truly wanted to be heard, or only to have someone affirm what I couldn't grasp myself. I allowed myself to listen to me before demanding it from others. That didn't mean I shut myself off. It meant I stopped making myself dependent. I stopped waiting in conversations for what didn't come. I spoke when I had something to say, not because I hoped for a reaction, but because it was true. And I learned that not every silence is a judgment. That some people don't ask simply because they don't see, not because they don't want to. And that my depth isn't worth less just because not everyone recognizes it. It was liberating when I stopped constantly trying to explain myself. I became clearer, calmer, more honest. I no longer said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. But I also stopped saying everything in the hope that someone would finally understand what I meant. I realized I don't have to convince people. I can show up without waiting to be fully understood. Because maybe it's not about someone completely understanding me. Maybe it's about daring to show myself, even if nobody can fully capture me. Maybe closeness doesn't lie in being entirely seen, but in the willingness to share anyway. And maybe true connection begins the moment I stop expecting and simply am. Open, imperfect, without having to prove anything. Today I listen differently. I ask less often, "What exactly do you mean?" And more often, "How does that feel for you?" I no longer want to analyze. I want to understand, but without claiming ownership. And I want to be met that same way. Not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a person who sometimes doesn't even know what's going on inside. It's a quiet, powerful moment when you no longer define yourself by being understood. When you stop waiting for someone to read you completely, and instead begin to take yourself seriously, with all that's unclear, contradictory, difficult, then you become freer. Not because you no longer need anyone, but because you finally stop making yourself dependent on others' reactions. Today I know I can share without it all landing. I can be heard even if not every word is understood. And I can be connected even if there are gaps. Because what matters isn't how deeply someone grasps me, but whether I'm willing to show up, even if nobody sees it all. Chapter 13. The exhaustion that comes from not being yourself. There is a kind of tiredness no amount of sleep can heal. It sits deeper, in a way you only notice late, because it doesn't strike suddenly but seeps slowly into your body, your thoughts, every reaction. I knew it well long before I understood where it came from. It didn't show up as external overwhelm but as a silent exhaustion within. A weariness not born of doing too much but of bending too long. I was tired even though my calendar looked manageable. I was drained even though I took breaks. I hardly felt myself, even though I knew exactly what I was feeling. And the more I tried to find myself again, the more elusive I became. Eventually it dawned on me. I wasn't exhausted because I did too much. I was exhausted because I had been someone I am not. Not out of ill will, not because I deliberately pretended. It was more subtle, almost invisible. I had adopted roles bit by bit, often unconsciously, out of consideration, out of habit, out of fear of not belonging anymore. I was understanding even when I was angry. I was polite though I wanted to shout. I nodded when inside I was shaking my head, and each time I did that, I lost a little energy, barely noticeable, but over the years, destructive. I knew how to come across. I knew what to say to be liked. I could fit into any group, adapt, get by. I was reflective, controlled, compliant, but never fully me. Always a bit smoother, a bit quieter, a bit more cautious than I really was. And at some point, I didn't know whether there was even a clear line between the role I was playing and who I truly was. That constant inner self-monitoring, that was what made me tired. Not life itself, but life with the handbrake on. I checked my words, my reactions, my gestures. I thought about how what I said would land, before I even knew whether I really wanted to say it. I was always one step ahead, not out of clarity but out of fear of rejection. And that takes its toll. Not immediately, but over time it drains every ounce of genuine vitality out of you. I remember standing alone in front of the mirror once. I looked at myself and felt I was staring at the shell of a person who functioned outwardly, but felt almost nothing inside. Yes, I was present. I was competent. I was courteous, reliable. But I did it for others, not for myself. And in that moment I realized how much energy it had cost me each day to push through without rocking the boat. I started counting back. Asked myself when I last laughed out loud without immediately wondering if it was too much. When I was last spontaneous without feeling the need to justify it. How often I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I thought my opinion didn't fit. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I was exhausted from betraying myself. The point at which I knew I had to change didn't come because I collapsed. It wasn't a burnout. No hospital stay, no dramatic turning point. It was simply realizing that I was hardly present inside anymore. That I existed, but didn't live. That I reacted, but nothing truly came from me. And I knew. If I kept going like this, I wouldn't just be tired one day. I'd be indifferent. And that scared me. So I started small. Not with grand gestures, but tiny steps. I allowed myself not to reply immediately in conversations. I let myself sound less friendly. I stopped smiling when I didn't feel like it. And what at first felt like a loss of control was actually the first step toward truth. I stopped using my energy to be pleasant and started using it to be real. It wasn't easy. It wasn't instantly freeing. It was often uncomfortable. Because you bump up against others' expectations, against your own fears, against the silence that emerges when you no longer automatically fill what others need from you. But over time, something else grew. Presence. I was there again. Not perfect, but present. Not compliant, but alive. I learned that my worth doesn't depend on how well I fit in. That I'm not obliged to please, that it's okay to be uncomfortable if it dignifies me, and that my vitality must matter to me more than my reputation. I had to stop protecting the version of myself that made life easier, but destroyed me. Today I know that true exhaustion doesn't come from the noise outside, but from the silence that grows inside when you no longer hear yourself. I'm no longer willing to bend myself for harmony. I'm no longer willing to lose myself for belonging, and I'm no longer willing to walk through rooms with a smile when I don't recognize myself. Because what made me so tired back then wasn't life. It was living as someone I was not. Chapter 14. The Trap of Always Having to Be Strong. It sounds like a compliment when someone calls you strong, and for a long time that was exactly what I wanted to hear. Strong meant resilient, coping. Not complaining, not collapsing, handling things even when they're hard. And I got good at it. I functioned, took responsibility, was there when needed. Pushed through even though I was inwardly exhausted. I was strong, and that was my pride. Until I realized that strength was slowly pulling me away from myself. Because what nobody says when they call you strong is everything you have to swallow to keep up that image. How often you suppress your pain because it's just not appropriate to be weak. How often you refuse help because you don't want anyone to think you need it. How often you grit your teeth, smile, carry on. Not because you feel good, but because you believe you must. Because you don't know what it feels like to say, I can't go on. I settled into that role, the one who has it all together, the one who holds others up, who listens, organizes, bears burdens. And every time I accomplished something that was really too much, I felt validated. Not relieved, but needed. And that mattered to me more than anything back then. Being strong was not just my self-image, it was my survival strategy. But it came at a price. While I looked strong, I grew emptier inside. I was so busy appearing stable for others that I eventually had no idea how to handle my own instability. I repressed, rationalized, downplayed. I told myself others had it harder, that I had no reason to complain, that I'd manage because I always did. And eventually I even believed it. And if tears did come, I felt ashamed. Not for what hurt, but for not having it more under control. What I didn't understand at the time was, strength without access to your own weakness isn't power. It's self-denial. I wasn't strong because I carried it all. I was strong because I never stopped carrying even when I should have let go. And the longer I did that, the less I could tell whether I was doing it out of conviction or simply because I couldn't do otherwise. I remember a day when I was completely overwhelmed. It wasn't a dramatic event, just many small things piling up. I felt constricted, exhausted, irritable. Yet I kept going as usual, answering messages, solving problems, keeping conversations afloat, until someone asked me, "Are you okay?" And I automatically replied, "Of course, all good." And in that moment, as I said it, I felt, that's not just a lie. That's a reflex now. I couldn't do otherwise. I had become such a function that I no longer took my own inner experience seriously. I had trained myself to see everything not strong as a nuisance to be sorted out later. Except that later never came. And eventually I understood. I'm not exhausted because I do too much. I'm exhausted because I constantly deny myself. The turning point came quietly. It wasn't the one moment I broke down. It was the gradual realization that I was no longer connected to myself or to those close to me. I was present, but not touchable. I was strong, but no longer real. And I didn't want that anymore. I wanted to feel without having to explain myself. I wanted to be allowed to be weak without feeling I'd lose something. So I began to question my definition of strength, piece by piece. I said no where I would have automatically said yes. I allowed myself breaks even though no one asked for them. I started to communicate honestly, even at the risk of being misunderstood. I stopped clinging to the facade of my functionality and let people see me in my chaos. It wasn't pleasant. Many people were unsettled, some disappointed. Others distanced themselves because they no longer knew how to read me. But I stayed. I held my ground, even in moments when I was unsure. And I learned that real strength doesn't lie in endurance, but in allowance. That I don't have to be more than I am to be lovable. That it's not my job to always be the rock, especially not when I'm crumbling inside. Today I know the greatest trap is believing you're only valuable when you look unshakable. But people don't connect to your strength. They connect to your authenticity, to your willingness to show up, even when you're not shining, even when you're not functioning, even when you're not in a good mood. I'm still strong, but not the old way. Not at the expense of myself. Not as a strategy, but as the consequence of taking myself seriously. I let myself fall when I can't hold on. And I stand up when I'm truly ready. Not because I think I have to. Because true strength begins where you stop trying to prove it. Chapter 15. When I decided to disappoint others, rather than keep disappointing myself. There came a point in my life when I no longer knew who I was doing all of this for. Who I said yes to, even though everything inside of me screamed no. Who I agreed to plans that felt like weights on my chest the moment I voiced them. Who I pulled myself together for, gave understanding to, compromised with, crossed my boundaries for. Not out of love, not out of conviction, but out of fear of not measuring up. I had learned that disappointment is something you must avoid at all costs. Disappoint no one. Be reliable. Be there. Be pleasant. Be the one people can depend on. The one who is never too much but always enough. The one who gives even when empty. The one who understands even when not understood. And I did that. For years. I disappointed no one. Except myself. Over and over. Quietly, systematically, almost dutifully. Because every time I adjusted when I didn't want to, I left myself a little behind. Every time I fit in, although the place didn't suit me, I added another crack to my inner integrity. I knew what I needed, but I didn't voice it. I felt when it was too much, but I smiled anyway. I noticed my time, my energy, my body protesting, but I ignored it because I didn't want to cause inconvenience. I was afraid to disappoint others, and since I couldn't bear that, I would rather disappoint myself. I held back, endured, explained, forgave too quickly, nodded too often. I was reasonable, sensible, functional. And then one day I asked myself, when was the last time I was truly honest? Not only in words, but in action, in decisions, in saying no. The turning point didn't come with a bang. It came in a moment of utter inner exhaustion. I sat in a room full of people who liked me, appreciated me, who meant me no harm. And yet I felt alien, because I knew. I'm only here because I didn't have the courage to say no. I'm only still part of this game because I never dared to step out of the role they expected of me. And I realized I was loyal, but not to myself. In the weeks that followed, I set a new standard. No longer what others expect, but what I can bear. No longer what goes down well, but what feels right. I practiced disappointing people, not out of spite, not to hurt, but to finally believe in myself again. I canceled. I withdrew. I said things I knew wouldn't be well received, and it hurt. It was uncomfortable. It took courage. But what came back was clarity. I no longer felt like a version of me that I had to maintain so everyone else would be satisfied. I was real again. And that also meant I became inconvenient. Not aggressive, not dismissive, but honest. I stopped catering to expectations that devoured me from within. I stopped giving away my yes like a consolation prize. I took myself seriously, and that meant others wouldn't always like it. I learned that you can't make everyone happy at once without losing yourself. I learned that some people are disappointed not because you harm them, but because they're not used to you setting boundaries. And I learned that my value doesn't depend on how little disturbance I cause, but on how honestly I live. Even if that means closing doors I once kept open out of obligation. It was a radical act of self-respect to say, I can't be everything to you if I'm nothing to myself. I no longer questioned my loyalty, but my motives. Why am I doing this, really? Out of fear of loss? Out of guilt? Out of conditioning? Or out of love? And I allowed myself to see that no can be a form of dignity. Not rebellion, not selfishness, but a clear decision not to live against myself any longer. I had to admit that I will disappoint people when I change. That they might not recognize me anymore. That they might like me less. That they might leave. But I also realized that is a price I can pay as long as I don't keep betraying myself. As long as I don't lie in bed at night asking why I sold out again, just to make someone else's day easier. Today I say no, not because I love less, but because I no longer bend myself into the ground to prove it. I disappoint expectations, but I no longer disappoint myself. I'm not always available, but I'm close to myself again. And I've learned that honesty sometimes hurts, but never as much as the ongoing pain of living a life that isn't yours. Because in the end, it's not about making everyone happy. It's about not making yourself unhappy just because you're afraid to disappoint someone else. Chapter 16. What I had to let go of without ever receiving an apology. There are things we carry with us, not because they're still happening, but because they were never completed. Wounds that never had a name. Questions that were never answered. Boundaries that we were told to overlook because it happened so long ago. And the silence afterward, heavier than the event itself. I carried many of those things with me, far too long, in the hope that one day someone would return and say, I'm sorry. But it never came. And at some point I realized it never would. I waited for years for insight, for explanations, for accountability. I held the pain like an open book in my hands, ready to close it the moment someone showed they'd read the pages. But life doesn't work that way. Most people leave without ever looking back. They leave traces without noticing how deep they go. And they go on living, while you're still trying to tidy up your inner world. I always thought forgiveness needed an apology, a sign that what happened was acknowledged. A word that says, "I see what I did to you." And maybe it would have been easier if that word had ever come. But it didn't. And eventually I had to decide whether to keep my life tethered to that missing gesture, or whether I could untie the knot within myself, even without the other person. What I had to let go of weren't just people. They were hopes. Hopes for conversations that never happened, for gestures that never came, for understanding that was never spoken. I waited for that one clarifying meeting, for the moment someone would say, "You were right. It wasn't okay." But the longer I waited, the more I realized I was clinging to an image that never truly existed. I didn't want restitution. I wanted dignity. And I hoped it would come from somewhere else. But dignity isn't something someone gives you. It begins the moment you stop sending yourself in circles just because someone else never had the courage to show up sincerely. I remember an encounter that changed everything. Years later, out of the blue on the street. We spoke politely, briefly, like people who know each other but aren't close anymore. No word about what happened. No look that went deeper. Just the usual distant exchange of pleasantries. And as I spoke, I realized I would never hear what I had so desperately wanted. And it didn't hurt me anymore, because by then I understood that my healing didn't depend on their regret. I began to free myself. I stopped imagining how it could have been. I stopped running internal dialogues that would never take place. I no longer spoke of old stories in the hope that someone would tell me how much I had been hurt. I already knew, and that was enough. Forgiveness is not a gift for the other person. It's a decision to find peace with yourself. Not because everything is okay, but because you stop letting yourself be defined by the pain. I had to learn that some things happened in my life without ever being explained, justified, or corrected, and that I still had the right to leave them behind. It wasn't easy. It often felt like an inner betrayal, as if I were letting something slide that shouldn't. But what I let go of wasn't the truth. It was the expectation that someone else would acknowledge it. I gave myself the right to say, "That was wrong, and I deserve for it to end." I was angry, not at the moment itself, but at the years afterward when I forced myself to hold back, stay quiet, smile. I felt how deep the pain ran, not because it had happened, but because I had doubted for so long whether it was even allowed to happen. I had to learn to believe myself again, to take myself seriously, after I had waited so often for someone else to do it. Today I know. Not every story ends with a handshake. Not every pain gets acknowledged. Not every wound is healed by the one who caused it. But I learned to pull myself out of the waiting loop. I no longer have to look back to be understood. I no longer have to hope for remorse from someone who never had the grace for it. And I don't have to stay silent when something tears me apart inside. What I let go of, without ever receiving an apology, was hard. But it made me lighter. Not immediately, not without a struggle, but step by step. I breathe differently now, freer, because I no longer chase anyone in my mind. I didn't free myself because someone else allowed it, but because I finally stopped waiting. And perhaps that is the deepest form of peace. Not understanding everything, not completing everything, but still moving forward, upright, awake, without needing someone else to finish your story. Chapter 17. The silence I needed to hear myself again. There was a time when I confused noise with life. I kept myself busy from morning to night. Conversations, appointments, messages, voices, tasks, all scheduled, all organized, all full of sound. And I thought, this is how it has to be. If you stand still, you lose. If you pause, you fall behind. If you have nothing to say, you get ignored. So I talked. So I ran. So I functioned. and the fuller it got around me, the emptier it became within me. What I didn't understand then was how loud it can get when you can't hear yourself anymore. When every decision is filtered through 10 other opinions. When every thought is immediately judged, compared, analyzed. When you live so outwardly that you don't notice how silenced you've become internally. I could no longer hear myself. Not my intuition. Not my no. Not my yes. I was like a voice on standby. I had forgotten how to deal with silence. Because it was too honest. Because it doesn't sugarcoat. Because it offers no distraction. In silence, you can't talk your way out or hide or suppress. In silence, you meet yourself. And that was long exactly what I feared. I remember the moment I consciously pulled the plug. No phone, no screen, no conversation, no background noise. Just me. An empty room. No to-do list, no appointments, no tasks. Just my body, my breath, my thoughts. And even though I had longed for it, at first there was nothing but restlessness. I felt how much I had gotten used to living over myself, and how loud the inner resistance became once it got quiet. But I stayed. I didn't go back. I didn't let the noise back in, even though every part of me screamed to do so. I wanted to know what was really in me, beneath all the voices, beneath all the expectations, beneath all the noise. And slowly, very slowly, I began to hear myself again. At first it was tentative. Fragments, thoughts I had once pushed away, feelings that had found no room, sadness for which there was never time, anger I had wrapped in politeness, wishes I no longer took seriously. And the longer I stayed in that silence, the clearer everything became. Not more pleasant, but more honest. I realized that I had ignored myself for years, not out of malice, but as a survival strategy. I had learned that being loud feels safe, that distraction means control, that functioning brings recognition, and all of that had taken me far from what I really wanted, what I really felt, what I really was. Silence didn't calm me. It woke me up. It showed me where I had lost myself. In relationships, in roles, in images I maintained just to belong, in dynamics that didn't fit me, in decisions that never came from within, but from fear of rejection. Suddenly I saw clearly where I had bent myself, and how long I'd been doing it. I began to question things I had accepted for years. Who is actually speaking in my head? Who tells me what I should, must, or may do? And why had I never examined those voices? I recognized that much of what I believed to be my truth was just learned reaction, conformity, habit, fear of being alone, and silence. It didn't make being alone any easier, but it made it real. I heard what I had once drowned out. That I was tired, that I longed for depth, that I no longer wanted to appear strong, but to be understood, that I no longer wanted to be perfect, but honest, that I was ready to let go of things that no longer fit, even if I first had to go through uncertainty. I learned to listen to my body again, to the twist in my gut when something was off, to the light feeling when something felt right, to the deep inhale when I was being honest. I slowed down, not because I was weaker, but because I was connected again. I no longer had to know everything immediately, decide immediately, answer immediately. I was allowed to feel, to wait, to observe again. And in this new way of listening, I rediscovered myself. Not as a concept, not as a role, not as a project to be optimized, but as a human being, with gaps, with questions, with longings. And I began to listen to myself the way I had always wanted others to listen to me, patiently, openly, without judgment. I understood that I don't have to lose myself to be loved, that I don't have to prove myself to be valuable, that I don't have to be loud to be heard, as long as I listen to myself, and that every truth that matters begins within me, not outside. Silence wasn't a goal. It was the space in which I found myself again, not suddenly, not perfectly, but truly. Chapter 18. When I understood that healing also means destruction. For a long time, I believed healing was something gentle, something calm, even beautiful. I thought that those who heal find peace, grow quietly, become clearer, stronger, more mature. I had images in my head of warm conversations, inner order, loving self-forgiveness. I thought of healing as a process of building up, never as an act of tearing down. But at some point I realized, there are wounds you don't heal by carefully covering them up. There are patterns that won't disappear as long as you only analyze them. And there are chapters of life you don't peacefully leave behind, but that you must destroy if you don't want to be lost in them. I had dragged so much with me, like a second skin over the years. Relationships in which I had long since vanished. Behaviors that kept me small because once they'd helped me survive. Beliefs that didn't come from me but grew in me like old tangled roots. I had settled into a life that wasn't mine, but I'd tended it for so long that it almost felt sacred. And at some point I reached a point where I couldn't breathe, not because everything was falling apart, but because I kept holding on. I began to feel that healing doesn't just mean finding new answers, but questioning old certainties. That it's not enough to reconcile with the past if you're still clinging to it. That you can't move forward if you merely repaint the old walls instead of tearing them down. I remember a night when I questioned everything in me. My job, my relationships, my way of treating myself. Not because they were all bad, but because I had run them for so long out of fear of losing something. I realized that much of what defined me didn't come from freedom, but from conformity. And I felt what I called my life was full of things I actually needed to get rid of to truly be myself. But letting go isn't just letting go. It also means separating, stopping, walking away. It means saying things that hurt, taking steps that nobody understands, leaving spaces where you once performed for years. And that doesn't feel like healing. That feels like destruction. I slammed doors I thought always had to stay open. I ended friendships, not out of hatred, but out of honesty. I shed roles in which I'd once shone because they gave me support, but no truth. And I disappointed people who would never understand why. Because my path to healing didn't match their image of me. And that was the test. To endure that your own transformation won't please everyone. That growth isn't always gentle. That it can hurt people when you save yourself. That they'll call you selfish when you break free from connections that harmed you. And that you still have to go on. Especially then. I was afraid of being seen as weak because I ended things others still held on to. I was afraid of seeming radical because I no longer argued. I simply walked away. I was afraid they'd judge me. And sometimes they did. But I realized, I can't both heal myself and comfort everyone else. At some point I had to decide whom I'd stay true to. The image I held in others' eyes, or my innermost feeling. And I chose what hurt, but was true. It was a process full of friction. I fell out of systems, out of groups, out of conversations where I once always had a place. I was no longer convenient. I was no longer available. I was no longer in control. And that made me vulnerable. But it also made me alive. I felt my boundaries again. I heard what I lacked. I knew again what I wanted, not out of defiance, but out of clarity. Healing wasn't the result of beautiful insights. It was the result of decisions that hurt, of words that had to be spoken, even though they destroyed something, of moments when I stood completely alone but felt for the first time that I was no longer betraying myself. I learned that ending something doesn't mean it was never important. that you can destroy things that once saved your life, because today they hold you back. That you may give yourself permission to be radical when it comes to not living against yourself. And that true new beginnings don't start where everything feels easy, but where you're willing to stop avoiding the hard parts. I didn't destroy people. I destroyed illusions. I destroyed adaptations that had kept me small. I destroyed stories I no longer wanted to play a part in. And from those ruins, something new emerged. Not immediately, not shiny, but real. Because sometimes the only way to truly heal is to break through everything that once held you together, but never truly carried you. Chapter 19. The self-love that comes only after the chaos. I had many ideas about what self-love meant. I thought it was soft, full of understanding, full of phrases like, "You are enough." I thought it came with rituals, with affirmations in front of the mirror, with peace and inner balance. But when it mattered most, it did not arrive on soft feet. It arrived through chaos, through ruptures, through darkness. It came when nothing else was left. I didn't find self-love when I was strong, but when I was flat on the ground. When I went through things I thought would destroy me. When I lost people I never wanted to lose. When I had to make decisions that demanded everything of me. When I watched the life I knew collapse piece by piece, not because I didn't love it, but because it no longer supported me. Self-love was what remained when I had to let go of everything I had once clung to. It wasn't a moment of enlightenment. It was a choice, made in the midst of pain, uncertainty, disorientation. I longed for support from outside, found none, and built it myself. I wanted to be seen, was overlooked, and started seeing myself. I wanted to be rescued, but nobody came, so I stood up. I learned that self-love isn't a feeling that washes over you. It's not sudden. It's not glamorous. It's not easy. It's the decision to stop abandoning yourself, even when you lose everything else. It's the promise to take yourself seriously, even when nobody else does. It's the deep, silent, "I'm here for me." When the storm raged inside me, when I had no words left, no direction, no certainty, I began to listen to myself. Not because it felt good, but because I had no more excuses to distract myself. I observed myself in moments of anger, of grief, of shame. I encountered sides of me I had fought for years, and I stopped fighting them. I stopped explaining them. I just sat with them. I began to understand that I don't have to heal first to deserve love, that I don't have to become a calm, productive, kind, reflective version of myself, that I also deserve the version of me that is chaotic, that doubts, that rages, that needs boundaries, that makes mistakes, and that true self-love begins exactly there, where I no longer want to improve, but to accept. I stopped comparing myself, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. I could no longer fight against images that were never mine. I didn't want to live a life that others liked but left me empty. I didn't want to function anymore. I wanted to feel, and I realized, if I wait for the world to finally love me in my entirety, I will wait forever. I have to start myself. So I stood in front of the mirror, not to find myself beautiful, but to see myself. I faced my thoughts, not to correct them, but to recognize where they came from. I didn't speak words of encouragement. I spoke honestly to myself. I no longer asked, "What's wrong with me?" but, "What does this part of me need that I've ignored for so long?" And slowly it grew quieter inside me. Not empty, but quiet, real. I noticed how much I can soothe myself. Not because everything is okay, but because I am present. I learned to care for myself, not by indulging, but by protecting. I made decisions not to please others, but to stop losing myself. And I learned to say no without guilt. to set boundaries without explaining myself, to withdraw without shame. Self-love didn't become my goal. It became my foundation. Not visible to others, but felt by me. It is the moment I stop running over myself just to function. It is the conversation in which I listen to myself before I speak out loud. It is the quiet nod in the midst of chaos that says, I know it's hard, and I'm still here. And the more I lived this, the clearer it became. I no longer have to prove my worthiness. I don't have to compensate. I don't have to hide. I don't have to be perfect, finished, optimized. I only have to be here, in my authenticity, in my depth, at my own pace. Because the self-love that comes after the chaos is not loud. It's not proud. It's not idealized. It's grounded. It knows the darkness. It knows the pain. And it stays. All the more because of it. Chapter 20. The day I stopped playing, and my life began. There is no loud bang when you stop playing. No dramatic finale. No applause. No visible curtain that falls. It's a quiet moment. Almost imperceptible. Maybe you're standing in front of the mirror. Maybe you're alone in your room. Maybe in a conversation you can't bear. And then it happens. You no longer say what is expected. You no longer nod automatically. You no longer smile out of duty. You stop playing along. I remember that day clearly. Not because something big happened on the outside, but because something inside broke and finally made room for what was real. I was tired of adapting, tired of smiling, tired of enduring, tired of being someone who no longer convinced me. I had rehearsed so long to appear perfect, strong, controlled, that I no longer knew how I acted when nobody was watching. And then, I just stood there, without a role, without a reaction, without a mask. And that was the beginning. I was afraid of no longer being liked, afraid of being too much, or too little. I thought that if I showed my true self, I would be abandoned, rejected, misunderstood. I had built my life so much on external approval that I barely took my own perception seriously. I could sell myself well. I could explain myself well. I could even let myself be loved, as long as it didn't go too deep, as long as it didn't touch what I really felt. But none of that made me alive. I lived adapted, not real. I existed in functions, not truth. And at some point it was obvious. The life I was leading was safe, but not true. The moment I ended the performance was unremarkable. I sat in a conversation where I would normally have smiled. I would have shown understanding. I would have answered diplomatically. But this time I said nothing. I let the facade fall. I didn't disagree just to be polite. I didn't explain myself. I didn't correct my expression, my posture, my voice. I was simply there, silent, upright, real. And in that silence something began to live that I had long forgotten. Myself. Not the version of me that keeps adapting to be accepted. Not the one that delivers performance to earn worthiness. Not the one that makes herself small to stay out of the way. But the version that doesn't play. That feels what it feels. That says what it means. That stays when it's right, and leaves when it isn't. I didn't know what would come next, whether I would still be loved if I became uncomfortable, whether I would still fit into the world if I no longer performed as expected. But I knew I couldn't stand betraying myself any longer, just so others wouldn't feel unsettled. So I began to speak authentically, to decide authentically, to feel authentically. And that also meant losing people who loved only my role, not me. It meant forming new relationships without rigid expectations. It meant questioning things I had once accepted as given. And yes, it also meant loneliness. Because when you stop playing, You are first alone with yourself, without a script, without applause, without safety. You don't know if anyone will stay. You don't know if you'll still be needed. You only know you can't go back. And that is where your life begins. Because it needs no audience. Because you no longer perform. Because you no longer react, but choose. You no longer orient yourself outward. You begin to create from within. Not perfectly, not strategically, but at your own pace, with your own voice, your own heartbeat. I realized that what I had mistaken for security was actually my greatest limitation. I protected myself in roles that at the same time suffocated me. And I realized that I owed no one anything except myself. That I no longer had to prove my lovability. That I no longer had to function to belong. That I no longer had to save anyone just to avoid feeling myself. The day I stopped playing wasn't the day everything got better, but it was the day everything became real. And that was enough. Today I know authenticity is not a strategy. Authenticity is a risk. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you unpredictable to a system built on conformity. But it makes you free. And that freedom is not something you can plan. It is a daily decision. For you, for your truth, for your life. Because you can do everything right, deliver everything, fulfill everything, and still be empty. Or you can show up, be yourself, stop justifying, and experience what it really feels like to live. And I promise you, it's worth it. Thank you for walking with me this far. If this audiobook has moved you, resonated with you, or accompanied you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, but it makes so much possible. Stay with yourself. And if you ever begin to lose yourself again, listen in once more.